The morning sun cast long shadows across the forward operating base as Marcus Chun wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. To everyone on the base, he was simply Cookie, the quiet guy who kept the mess hall running and somehow managed to make military rations taste almost decent. His calloused hands moved with practiced efficiency as he prepped vegetables for the day's first meal, the rhythmic chopping of his knife creating a steady beat that had become as familiar as the distant rumble of helicopters. Marcus had been working in the kitchen for 8 months now, ever since his reassignment from active duty. The other soldiers saw him as just another support staff member, someone who had probably never seen real combat. They were grateful for his cooking skills, but rarely looked beyond the apron and chef's hat. If they had looked closer, they might have noticed the way his eyes constantly swept the room, cataloging exits and potential threats. They might have seen how his seemingly relaxed posture could shift into something more alert at the slightest unusual sound. But they didn't look closer, and Marcus preferred it that way. The transition from Force Reconnaissance Marine to Mess Hall Cook hadn't been easy. 3 years ago, Marcus had been part of an elite unit that operated behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence and conducting high-risk missions that most people would never hear about. His team had been his brothers, and together they had faced impossible odds in some of the most dangerous territories in the world. He had been trained to survive in any environment, to think 10 steps ahead of his enemies, and to use any weapon or tool at his disposal with deadly precision. Everything changed during a mission in the mountains. An ambush had gone wrong, and Marcus had watched helplessly as his best friend and fellow Marine, David Rodriguez, bled out in his arms while waiting for extraction. The guilt and trauma had followed him home, manifesting in sleepless nights and flashbacks that made normal life feel impossible. After months of struggling, his commanding officers had offered him a different kind of service, one that would keep him useful to the military while giving him space to heal. The kitchen had become his sanctuary. The familiar routines of meal preparation gave structure to his days, and the satisfaction of feeding his fellow servicemen provided a sense of purpose that helped quiet the ghosts in his head. He had thrown himself into learning every aspect of food service, discovering that the same attention to detail that had made him an excellent reconnaissance Marine also made him an exceptional cook. The base commander had been so impressed with the improvement in morale and meal quality that Marcus had been given free rein over the entire food operation. As he worked that morning, Marcus found himself thinking about David, as he often did while his hands stayed busy. They had planned to open a restaurant together after their service ended, combining Marcus's love of cooking with David's natural charm and business sense. The dream had died with David, but somehow, feeding people had become a way to honor his memory. The breakfast rush began around 0600 hours, and Marcus fell into his usual rhythm. He had learned the preferences of most of the soldiers by now. Sergeant Williams always wanted extra hot sauce. Private Johnson picked around anything green, and Lieutenant Crawford somehow managed to eat twice as much as anyone else while maintaining his lean frame. Marcus made mental notes as he served, adjusting portions and preparations to keep everyone satisfied. Around mid-morning, as Marcus was preparing ingredients for lunch, Captain Sarah Mitchell appeared at the kitchen entrance. She was the base intelligence officer, and Marcus had noticed her watching him more carefully than the others over the past few weeks. She was sharp, observant, and Marcus suspected she had figured out there was more to his background than his file indicated. "Got a minute, Cookie?" she asked, using the nickname that everyone had adopted for him. Marcus looked up from the onions he was dicing, noting the serious expression on her face. "Sure, Captain. What can I do for you?" She glanced around the empty kitchen before stepping closer. "I've been reviewing personnel files, and I couldn't help but notice some interesting gaps in your service record. Mind if I ask what you did before you ended up here?" Marcus considered his response carefully. His reassignment had been handled quietly, and his previous service details were classified at a level that most people on the base wouldn't have access to. "I was infantry," he said simply, returning to his prep work. "Did my time, got reassigned here." Captain Mitchell studied him for a long moment. "Infantry doesn't usually teach knife skills like that," she observed, watching as Marcus's blade moved through the vegetables with surgical precision. "And infantry doesn't usually move with quite so much awareness of their surroundings." Marcus paused in his cutting, meeting her eyes directly. There was intelligence there, and a sharpness that reminded him of some of his former teammates. Some people pick things up faster than others, he said evenly. She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already suspected. Well, whatever your background, the troops appreciate what you do here. Morale has been significantly higher since you took over the kitchen. That's good to hear, Marcus replied, genuinely pleased. Anything else I can help you with? Actually, yes. I wanted to give you a heads up about something. We've received intelligence that suggests increased enemy activity in the area. Nothing immediate, but we're implementing enhanced security protocols starting today. I thought you should know, given that the mess hall is one of the few areas where large numbers of personnel gather regularly. Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the old instincts stirring to life. What kind of activity? Reconnaissance mostly, but there have been some concerning patterns. Small groups moving closer to our perimeter, testing our response times and security measures. Could be nothing, but she shrugged. Better to be prepared. After she left, Marcus found himself looking at the kitchen with new eyes. The large windows that let in natural light suddenly seemed like potential vulnerabilities. The multiple entrances that made serving efficient could also provide multiple attack vectors. The dining area, which could hold nearly 200 people during peak meal times, would be a devastating target if someone wanted to cause maximum casualties. He pushed the thoughts away, forcing himself to focus on lunch preparation. There was no point in borrowing trouble, and his job now was to feed people, not to plan military operations. But, as he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet months in the kitchen might be coming to an end. The lunch rush passed without incident, though Marcus found himself paying more attention to the faces coming through the line. He had always been observant, but now he was actively looking for anything out of place. Unfamiliar faces, unusual behavior, signs that someone didn't belong. Old habits were hard to break, and the skills that had kept him alive during his reconnaissance days were still there, just below the surface. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus began his preparations for dinner. It was going to be a special meal. He had managed to procure some fresh meat and vegetables through his supply connections, and he was planning to prepare something that would remind the troops of home. Cooking had become his way of taking care of his fellow servicemen, of giving them something to look forward to in an environment where comfort was rare. He was seasoning a large roast when he heard the first explosion. It was distant, but unmistakable, the sharp crack of a breaching charge, followed by the rapid chatter of automatic weapons fire. Marcus dropped his seasoning and moved to the window, his body automatically adopting a combat-ready stance as he scanned the horizon. Through the kitchen window, he could see smoke rising from the direction of the main gate. The base alarm began to sound, its urgent wail cutting through the afternoon air. Marcus heard shouting from outside, the sound of boots running on concrete, and the mechanical voice of the base announcement system declaring a security alert. His mind immediately shifted into tactical mode, years of training overriding months of kitchen routine. The attack was coordinated. The timing suggested that whoever was responsible had been watching the base long enough to know the guard rotations and meal schedules. This wasn't a random assault. It was a calculated strike designed to catch the base at its most vulnerable moment. Marcus moved away from the window and began to assess his situation. The mess hall was isolated from the main defensive positions, making it a poor place to make a stand but also meaning that it might be overlooked in the initial assault. He could hear more explosions now, closer than before, and the sound of small arms fire was intensifying. He knew he had a choice to make. He could follow protocol and head to the designated shelter area, keeping his head down and hoping that the base's defenses would hold. Or he could acknowledge what he really was underneath the apron and chef's hat and prepare to do what he had been trained to do. As if to make the decision for him, Marcus heard the sound of vehicles approaching the mess hall at high speed. Through the kitchen window, he could see 3 pickup trucks racing across the compound, kicking up clouds of dust as they headed directly toward the building. Each truck carried several armed figures, and Marcus could see the distinctive markings and equipment that identified them as enemy combatants. The quiet months in the kitchen were definitely over. Marcus looked around at his workspace. The knives, the heavy pots and pans, the industrial equipment that had become so familiar. In the hands of someone with the right training, a kitchen could provide an arsenal of weapons and defensive positions. Marcus Chun, the mild-mannered cook known as Cookie, might not be much use in a fight. But Marcus Chun, Force Reconnaissance Marine, was an entirely different matter. The trucks were getting closer, and Marcus could hear the enemy fighters shouting to each other in a language he didn't recognize but had learned to fear during his active duty days. They would be here in minutes, and when they arrived, they would discover that the quiet cook who had been feeding their enemies had been hiding some very dangerous secrets. Marcus moved with the fluid efficiency of someone whose muscle memory had been forged in life-or-death situations. The approaching vehicles meant he had maybe 2 minutes before the mess hall would be compromised. 2 minutes to transform from Cookie the cook into the weapon he had once been. His hands, which moments ago had been delicately seasoning a roast, now moved with deadly purpose as he began to prepare for war. The industrial kitchen offered more tactical advantages than most people would realize. Marcus grabbed a large chef's knife, testing its balance with the practiced motion of someone who understood that any blade could be lethal in the right hands. He secured 2 more knives in his belt, their familiar weight providing a comfort that went beyond their practical value. The massive gas burners could provide both concealment and improvised weapons if needed, and the heavy steel prep tables could serve as cover. Marcus quickly shut off the main gas lines, eliminating the risk of explosion while preserving his ability to control individual burner feeds. He had learned during his reconnaissance training that controlling your environment was often the difference between success and failure. The kitchen's multiple exits and entrances, which had made food service efficient, now became tactical options for movement and escape. The sound of the approaching vehicles grew louder, accompanied by voices shouting in what Marcus recognized as a local dialect. He positioned himself behind the main prep station, where he could see both the primary entrance and the service door that led to the dining area. From this position, he could monitor multiple approach vectors while remaining concealed behind the stainless steel equipment. As the first truck screeched to a halt outside the main entrance, Marcus felt the familiar calm that had always come over him before combat. The months of kitchen routine fell away, replaced by the hyper-awareness that had kept him alive during dozens of dangerous missions. His breathing slowed and steadied. His heart rate dropped to the controlled rhythm he had learned to maintain under fire. The mess hall's main doors burst open with a crash that echoed through the dining area. Marcus counted the footsteps, identifying at least 6 individuals moving through the space with the scattered urgency of fighters who were more focused on speed than tactical precision. Their voices carried excitement and aggression, suggesting they believed they were dealing with an undefended target. Through the service window that connected the kitchen to the dining area, Marcus caught his first glimpse of the enemy fighters. They were dressed in a mixture of military surplus and civilian clothing, carrying assault rifles that looked well-maintained despite their improvised appearance. These weren't regular soldiers, but they weren't amateurs either. Their movement patterns suggested some level of training, though not the disciplined coordination Marcus would have expected from professional military units. The leader of the group was a tall man with a distinctive scar running from his left ear to his jawline. He gestured to his companions while speaking rapidly, pointing toward different areas of the mess hall, as if assigning positions. Marcus could see that they were preparing to use the dining area as a staging point, probably planning to secure it before moving on to other targets within the base. Marcus knew he had to act before they became too entrenched in their positions. The element of surprise was his greatest advantage, and once they discovered his presence, his options would become much more limited. He had faced similar odds during his active duty, but never while wearing an apron and surrounded by kitchen equipment instead of military gear. The service window provided an excellent observation point, but Marcus knew it could also expose him if he wasn't careful. He watched as 3 of the fighters moved toward the far end of the dining area, while the other 3 began setting up what looked like communications equipment near the main entrance. The separation of the group created an opportunity, but Marcus would need to time his actions perfectly. He selected a heavy cast iron skillet from the rack above his head, testing its balance and weight. In the hands of someone trained in improvised weapons, cooking equipment could be devastatingly effective. Marcus had once used a similar pan to disable an enemy sentry during a night infiltration mission, and the technique that had worked in the mountains would work just as well in a military mess hall. The first target was the fighter closest to the kitchen entrance, a young man who had separated from his group to investigate the food service area. Marcus could hear him moving through the storage room adjacent to the kitchen, his footsteps growing closer with each passing second. The fighter was being careless, probably assuming that anyone in the area would either be hiding or would have fled when the attack began. Marcus positioned himself beside the entrance, the cast iron skillet raised and ready. When the door opened and the fighter stepped through, Marcus struck with the precision and force that years of training had ingrained in his muscle memory. The pan connected with the side of the man's head with a dull thud, and he dropped immediately, his weapon clattering across the kitchen floor. Marcus caught the falling rifle before it could make any more noise, quickly checking to ensure the fighter was unconscious but still breathing. He had no desire to kill unless absolutely necessary, but he couldn't afford to have enemies moving freely through his environment. He quickly secured the unconscious man's hands with kitchen twine and moved him behind the large freezer unit where he wouldn't be immediately visible. The captured rifle was an older model assault weapon, but it was clean and well-maintained. Marcus checked the magazine and found it fully loaded with 30 rounds of ammunition. He also discovered 2 additional magazines in the fighter's tactical vest, giving him enough firepower to engage the remaining targets if stealth became impossible. Through the service window, Marcus could see that his actions hadn't been noticed by the other fighters. They were still focused on their own tasks, setting up equipment and securing their positions in the dining area. The communications gear they were installing suggested this was part of a larger, coordinated attack on the base, and the mess hall was intended to serve as a command post for operations in this sector. Marcus realized that his situation was more complex than a simple defensive action. If he could capture or eliminate this group, he might be able to gather intelligence about the broader attack and potentially save lives elsewhere on the base. The radio equipment they were setting up could provide valuable information about enemy positions, timing, and objectives. He moved carefully through the kitchen, using the large equipment and prep stations for concealment as he worked his way toward a better position. The industrial dishwashing station provided an excellent vantage point that allowed him to observe the entire dining area while remaining hidden behind the stainless steel machinery. From this position, Marcus could see that the fighters had divided into 2 clear groups. 3 men were working on the communications setup near the main entrance, while the other 3 were positioning themselves to cover the secondary exits. The tactical arrangement was competent, but not sophisticated, suggesting they had received basic training but lacked the advanced coordination skills that would have made them truly dangerous. Marcus noticed that one of the fighters near the communications equipment kept looking toward the kitchen area, as if he was wondering where his companion had gone. It wouldn't be long before they realized that someone was missing, and once that happened, Marcus's advantage of surprise would be gone. He needed to act quickly and decisively. The fighter who had been looking toward the kitchen began to move in that direction, speaking to the group leader as he walked. Marcus could see the concern building in the man's expression, and he knew that discovery was only moments away. Rather than wait for the situation to deteriorate, Marcus decided to take control of the initiative. He had identified the group's leader as the primary target. Taking out the command structure would disrupt their coordination and potentially cause the remaining fighters to make mistakes. Marcus had learned during his reconnaissance training that eliminating key personnel was often more effective than trying to engage an entire group simultaneously. The kitchen's layout provided multiple approach routes to the dining area, including a path through the storage room that would bring him out behind the communications setup. Marcus slung the captured rifle across his back and selected a different approach tool, a large meat cleaver that would be both silent and decisive if he could get close enough to use it. Moving through the storage room required careful navigation around boxes of supplies and equipment, but Marcus's training had taught him how to move silently through any environment. Each step was placed deliberately, each movement calculated to avoid making noise or casting shadows that might alert his targets. As he reached the edge of the storage room, Marcus could hear the fighters talking among themselves in their local language. While he didn't understand all the words, He could pick up enough to know they were discussing their timeline and objectives. They seemed confident that the base's defenses were collapsing and that their mission was proceeding according to plan. Marcus paused at the storage room exit, mentally rehearsing his next moves. Once he entered the dining area, he would be committed to action. There would be no retreat, no second chances, and no opportunity to reconsider his approach. This was the moment when Cookie the Cook would disappear forever, replaced by the Force Reconnaissance Marine who had never really left. The fighter who had been approaching the kitchen was now only a few feet away from discovering his unconscious companion. Marcus could see the man's growing concern as he noticed the silence from the kitchen area. In another few seconds, he would investigate more thoroughly and discover that they were no longer alone in the mess hall. Marcus took a deep breath, centered himself in the calm focus that had carried him through so many dangerous missions, and prepared to remind these fighters why it was dangerous to underestimate a United States Marine, even one who spent his days cooking instead of fighting. Marcus emerged from the storage room like a shadow given deadly purpose. The fighter approaching the kitchen area had his back turned, completely focused on the investigation ahead of him. Marcus closed the distance between them in 3 silent steps, the meat cleaver remaining sheathed as he opted for a quieter approach. His left arm wrapped around the fighter's neck in a sleeper hold perfected during years of close-quarters combat training, while his right hand secured the man's weapon before he could raise an alarm. The fighter struggled briefly, but Marcus's technique was flawless. Within seconds, the man went limp, unconscious but alive. Marcus lowered him quietly to the floor behind a bank of tables, securing his hands and removing his ammunition before returning his attention to the remaining 4 fighters in the dining area. Now only the leader and 3 followers remained active, but they were becoming suspicious. The scarred leader was speaking more urgently to his men, gesturing toward the kitchen area with growing concern. Marcus could see him reaching for his radio, probably preparing to call for backup or report that something was wrong. This was exactly the situation Marcus had hoped to avoid, but sometimes combat required adaptation rather than perfect execution. Marcus unslung the captured rifle and checked its action one final time. The weapon felt familiar in his hands despite the months he had spent holding cooking utensils instead of firearms. Muscle memory was a powerful thing, and the skills that had made him an elite reconnaissance marine were still there, waiting beneath the surface of his civilian persona. The dining area layout provided both opportunities and challenges. The scattered tables and chairs could provide concealment and cover, but they also created visual obstacles that might allow enemies to move without being detected. Marcus had learned to use such environments to his advantage, turning the chaos of civilian spaces into tactical assets. He positioned himself at the edge of the dining area, using an overturned table for cover while maintaining clear sight lines to all 4 remaining fighters. The communications equipment they had been setting up was nearly complete, with cables running to what appeared to be a satellite uplink system. If they managed to establish communications with their command structure, the tactical situation could change dramatically. Marcus made a quick assessment of his targets. The group leader remained near the communications setup, supervising its completion while maintaining overwatch of his men. 2 fighters were positioned to cover the main entrances, while the 4th was moving between positions, apparently serving as a runner or coordinator. The spacing between them was good from their perspective, but created opportunities for someone with Marcus's training. The key was to disrupt their coordination before they could respond effectively to his presence. Marcus had learned that surprise was a finite resource. Once it was expended, victory would depend on superior tactics, training, and execution. He needed to use his initial advantage to maximum effect. Marcus decided to target the communications equipment first. Destroying their ability to coordinate with external forces would isolate them and prevent them from calling for reinforcements. The satellite uplink looked sophisticated but fragile, and a well-placed shot could disable it permanently. He raised the rifle, using the table edge to stabilize his aim while remaining concealed behind its overturned surface. The distance was less than 50 meters, an easy shot for someone with his marksmanship training. Marcus controlled his breathing, settled his sight picture, and squeezed the trigger with the smooth pressure that had been drilled into him during countless hours of range training. The rifle cracked once, and the satellite dish exploded in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The sudden destruction of their equipment caused immediate chaos among the fighters, who dove for cover while shouting to each other in their native language. The group leader's voice rose above the others, trying to maintain control while assessing this new threat. Marcus was already moving before the echo of his shot had faded. Static positions were death traps in close-quarters combat, and he needed to maintain momentum while his enemies were still reacting to his initial attack. He rolled left, using a combination of overturned furniture and kitchen equipment to mask his movement, while keeping his rifle ready for immediate use. The fighter nearest to Marcus's position opened fire, spraying automatic rounds across the area where he had been positioned moments before. The shots chewed up tables and chairs, sending splinters and debris flying through the air, but Marcus was no longer there. He had learned to think several moves ahead, positioning himself where his enemies would least expect him to be. From his new position behind the serving line, Marcus had a clear shot at the fighter who had just revealed his location with muzzle flash. The man was still firing at empty space, apparently believing he had Marcus pinned down behind the overturned table. It was a fatal miscalculation that Marcus exploited without hesitation. His second shot was as precise as his first, striking the fighter's center mass and dropping him immediately. Marcus felt no satisfaction in the kill, only the grim recognition that combat was about survival rather than glory. Every shot he fired increased his chances of making it out alive, while every missed opportunity could lead to his own death. The remaining 3 fighters were adapting quickly to the threat, moving to establish better positions and coordinate their response. Marcus could see them communicating through hand signals, indicating a level of training that exceeded his initial assessment. These weren't random insurgents. They were part of an organized unit with professional military experience. The group leader was shouting orders while advancing toward Marcus's general area, using covering fire from his companions to mask his movement. Marcus recognized the tactic as a standard assault drill, executed with competence, if not exceptional skill. They were treating him as a significant threat, which meant his disguise as a harmless cook was completely blown. Marcus needed to change his approach. The rifle was effective, but loud, and its use would eventually draw attention from other enemy forces in the area. He also had limited ammunition, and a prolonged firefight would favor the fighters who might receive reinforcements. It was time to leverage other aspects of his training. He holstered the rifle and drew one of the kitchen knives he had secured earlier. Close-quarters combat was dangerous, but offered advantages that long-range engagement couldn't provide. Marcus could use his superior training and familiarity with the environment to offset the enemy's numerical advantage. The mess hall's kitchen equipment provided numerous tactical opportunities for someone who understood improvised weapons and environmental exploitation. The industrial gas lines could be weaponized if necessary. The heavy equipment could provide both cover and offensive options, and the multiple levels of the serving area created opportunities for vertical movement that might confuse his opponents. Marcus began moving through the serving area, using the stainless steel equipment to mask his approach while staying below the sight lines his enemies would naturally expect. The industrial dishwashing station provided an excellent covered route that brought him closer to the main dining area without exposing him to direct fire. As he moved, Marcus could hear the fighters repositioning themselves, trying to establish a perimeter that would prevent him from escaping while giving them clear fields of fire. Their voices carried the tension of men who had discovered that their easy mission had become a life-or-death struggle against an opponent they hadn't expected to encounter. The group leader was calling out in accented English now, apparently trying to communicate with what he assumed was a trapped American soldier. "You cannot escape. Surrender now, and we will show mercy." The words carried desperation rather than confidence, suggesting that the loss of 2 men and their communications equipment had significantly altered their assessment of the situation. Marcus ignored the calls for surrender, focusing instead on his tactical situation. He was outnumbered 3-1, had limited ammunition, and was fighting in an environment that provided as many disadvantages as advantages. However, he also had the benefit of superior training, extensive experience in close-quarters combat, and the psychological advantage that came from his enemies' growing uncertainty about who they were really fighting. From his position in the dishwashing area, Marcus could see one of the remaining fighters moving through the dining area in what appeared to be an attempt to flank his previous position. The man was moving carefully but predictably, following a path that would bring him within striking distance of Marcus's current location. Marcus prepared himself for close-quarters engagement, drawing the kitchen knife and positioning himself where he could intercept the approaching fighter. The industrial environment provided both cover and weapons, and Marcus had learned to view every aspect of his surroundings as potential tactical assets. The fighter appeared around the corner of the serving station, his rifle raised and ready but pointed toward where he expected to find his target. Instead, he found Marcus waiting in a position that allowed for immediate, decisive action. The combat knife struck with the precision of someone who had been trained to kill quickly and efficiently, and the fighter dropped without having a chance to raise an alarm. 3 down, 2 remaining. Marcus retrieved the fallen fighter's weapon and ammunition, improving his tactical situation while maintaining his position of concealment. The group leader and his remaining companion would be getting desperate now, knowing they had lost the majority of their team to an opponent they still couldn't clearly identify. Marcus could hear them moving through the dining area, their voices carrying the stress of men who realized their situation had deteriorated beyond their ability to control. The easy mission had become a nightmare, and they were trapped in an unfamiliar environment with an enemy who seemed to anticipate their every move. The time had come to end this confrontation decisively. Marcus had eliminated the immediate threat to the mess hall, but he needed to finish the job before reinforcements arrived or the remaining fighters managed to escape and report on what they had encountered. The quiet cook named Cookie was about to complete his transformation back into the Force Reconnaissance Marine he had never stopped being. The silence in the mess hall had become oppressive, broken only by the distant sounds of battle echoing across the base and the careful movements of the 2 remaining fighters. Marcus could sense their growing desperation as they realized they were dealing with someone far more dangerous than they had anticipated. The easy target had become a hunter, and they were now the prey in an environment they didn't understand. Marcus moved through the kitchen area with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in combat. Every piece of equipment, every corner, every shadow was a tactical asset he could exploit. The months he had spent working in this space had given him an intimate knowledge of its layout that his enemies couldn't match, and he intended to use that advantage to maximum effect. The group leader's voice carried through the dining area, speaking in rapid, urgent tones to his remaining companion. Marcus could pick out enough words to understand that they were debating whether to retreat or make a final stand. The smart move would be to withdraw and report what they had encountered, but military pride and the loss of their teammates might push them toward a more aggressive response. Marcus positioned himself near the main serving line, where he could observe both remaining fighters through the service windows while maintaining multiple escape routes. The leader was moving methodically through the dining area, checking corners and potential hiding spots with the careful attention of someone who had finally recognized the level of threat he was facing. His remaining companion was providing overwatch, positioned near the main entrance with a clear view of the dining area. The tactical situation was approaching its climax. Marcus had successfully eliminated most of the threat, but the 2 survivors were the most experienced and cautious members of the group. They had learned from the mistakes that had cost their teammates their lives, and they were adapting their approach accordingly. Marcus decided to force their hand rather than allow them to establish a defensive position. He selected a large serving tray from the kitchen equipment, testing its weight and balance. In the right hands, any object could become a weapon, and Marcus's training had taught him to improvise with whatever materials were available. He threw the tray across the dining area, where it clattered loudly against a table in the far corner. The sound immediately drew automatic fire from both remaining fighters, revealing their positions while wasting ammunition on an empty target. Marcus used their momentary distraction to advance through the serving area, closing the distance between himself and his opponents. The group leader realized his mistake quickly, ceasing fire and calling out to his companion in their native language. Marcus could see him gesturing frantically, trying to coordinate a response to this new threat. But coordination required communication, and communication took time that Marcus wasn't going to give them. Marcus emerged from the serving area with explosive speed, using an overturned table as a launching point that brought him into the dining area proper. The remaining companion had his weapon trained on the wrong area, still focused on the corner where the tray had landed. Marcus covered the distance between them in seconds, striking with the combat knife before the fighter could adjust his aim. The group leader spun toward the sound of the scuffle, raising his rifle to engage this new threat. But Marcus was already moving, using the body of his latest victim as partial cover while drawing his sidearm. The final confrontation would be decided by speed, accuracy, and the kind of split-second decision-making that separated elite warriors from ordinary soldiers. Both men fired simultaneously, their weapons speaking with the sharp authority of modern combat. Marcus felt the burn of a bullet grazing his left shoulder, but his own shot found its mark center mass. The group leader staggered backward, his rifle dropping from nerveless fingers as he collapsed against one of the dining tables. Marcus approached the fallen leader carefully, keeping his weapon ready despite the man's obvious injuries. The fighter was still conscious, but critically wounded, his breathing shallow and labored. Marcus could see that he had only minutes to live, but those minutes might provide valuable intelligence about the broader attack on the base. "How many more?" Marcus asked in English, kneeling beside the dying man while maintaining awareness of his surroundings. The fighter's eyes focused on Marcus with difficulty, taking in the blood-stained apron and the obviously professional way he handled his weapons. "You are not Cook," he managed to whisper in heavily accented English. "No," Marcus confirmed. "I'm not. How many more fighters? Where are they attacking?" The man's lips curved in what might have been a smile. "Too many. You cannot stop them all." His breathing became more labored, and Marcus could see that he was fading quickly. "Maybe not," Marcus agreed. "But I stopped you." The fighter's eyes closed, and his breathing ceased. Marcus checked for a pulse to confirm what he already knew, then began searching the bodies for intelligence materials. The communications equipment they had been setting up might contain valuable information about enemy positions and objectives. The damaged satellite uplink was beyond repair, but Marcus found a handheld radio among the equipment that was still functional. He tuned it to what appeared to be the enemy's command frequency, listening to the chatter that revealed the scope of the attack on the base. Multiple teams were engaged across different sectors, and the assault was larger and more coordinated than the base's defenders had initially realized. Marcus keyed the radio, speaking in the local dialect he had learned during his active duty tours. "Kitchen team to command. Mess hall secured. No resistance encountered." The deception might buy valuable time for the base's defenses while confusing enemy coordination. The response came immediately, confirming that the ruse was working. The enemy commander acknowledged the false report and instructed kitchen team to move to their secondary objective. Marcus now had intelligence about enemy movements and timing that could prove crucial to the base's survival. He quickly gathered weapons and ammunition from the fallen fighters, creating a small arsenal that would allow him to continue engaging enemy forces if necessary. The rifle he had captured was in excellent condition, and the additional magazines would give him the firepower needed for sustained combat operations. As Marcus prepared to leave the mess hall, he caught sight of his reflection in one of the stainless steel surfaces. The man looking back at him bore little resemblance to Cookie, the mild-mannered cook who had been preparing lunch just hours earlier. The transformation was complete. The Force Reconnaissance Marine had fully emerged from his civilian disguise. Marcus made his way toward the base's command center, using the intelligence he had gathered to avoid enemy positions while moving through areas that were still under friendly control. The radio chatter continued to provide updates on enemy movements, and Marcus passed this information to base security forces whenever he encountered them. The battle for the base continued for several more hours, but the tide had turned in favor of the defenders. The intelligence Marcus had provided allowed the command staff to anticipate enemy movements and coordinate effective counterattacks. By evening, the last of the attacking forces had been either eliminated or driven off. Captain Mitchell found Marcus in the aftermath, as he was helping to treat wounded personnel in the medical facility. She studied him carefully, taking in the blood on his clothes and the way other soldiers were looking at him with newfound respect. I'm guessing your service record has some interesting details that weren't in the summary I read, she observed. Marcus looked up from the soldier he was helping to bandage. Some details or need to know, he replied simply. And now I need to know? Marcus considered the question carefully. Force reconnaissance. 3 tours, multiple classified operations. I was reassigned here after I lost my team leader. Thought I was done with that life. Captain Mitchell nodded slowly. Apparently, that life wasn't done with you. The base commander wants to see you, by the way. Something about a commendation and a conversation about your future assignment options. As Marcus finished helping the wounded soldier, he thought about what the captain had said. The quiet months in the kitchen had been exactly what he needed to heal from his previous experiences, but today had reminded him of who he really was underneath the civilian facade. The skills that had made him an elite warrior were still there, still sharp, still ready to be used in defense of his fellow Marines. The mess hall would need a new cook, Marcus realized. Cookie had served his purpose, providing cover and healing for a warrior who had needed time to recover from his wounds. But the events of today had proven that some transformations were only temporary, and some identities could never be completely abandoned. Marcus walked toward the command center, leaving behind the kitchen that had been his sanctuary and stepping back into the world where he had always belonged. The Force Reconnaissance Marine had returned, and he was ready to resume the mission he had never really abandoned, protecting his fellow servicemen and defending the values he had sworn to uphold. Behind him, the mess hall stood empty, its kitchen equipment silent, and waiting for someone new to take over the daily task of feeding the troops. But the legacy of what had happened there would live on in the stories told by the soldiers who had witnessed the day when their quiet cook had revealed himself to be one of the most dangerous men on the base. The enemy had expected to find easy targets in the mess hall. Instead, they had discovered that appearances could be deceiving, and that sometimes the most dangerous warriors were the ones who looked like they had never seen combat. Marcus Chun had spent months proving he could cook with the best of them. Today, he had reminded everyone that he could fight with the elite few.